We are very lucky today to have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Burt Folsom. I've been a fan of Dr. Folsom's writing since he worked at a sister think tank of ours in Michigan, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and always enjoyed and looked forward to the things that he wrote. He has now published his 6th book. It's called The New Deal, or The Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. And it gave me a great idea that with the economy in such bad shape, one thing we can do to stimulate the economy is for everyone to buy one of his books today. $20, a special price, cheaper than you can get it anywhere else, and I believe he's willing to sign some books afterwards. It is a great book. I'm about halfway through it, and every page you learn something that you didn't know before. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we've been lucky, and our timing of our events has been very good. We had an energy event a few months ago, right when gas prices were spiking. We've had some other events that were very timely, usually due more to luck than our planning. But this one is timely, sort of in an unfortunate sense, because we're talking about the Depression and the things that FDR did, raising taxes, massive increases in spending, and increases in regulation. And as you know, yesterday the stock market hit a 12-year low, and President Obama announced massive tax increases. So, as Yogi Berra might say, it's sort of like deja vu all over again. We're in for a great treat. Dr. Folsom's like the history professor that you always wish you had. You would have enjoyed history much more, because I've seen him speak. He is a great speaker, and you actually learn something. He's a native of Lincoln, Nebraska. He studied at Center College in Kentucky before receiving his bachelor's degree at Indiana University. He has a master's from the University of Nebraska and a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He currently holds the Charles Klein Chair in History and Management at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. And if you're not familiar with Hillsdale, one of the greatest institutes of higher education in our country. Our own Carl Houck is an alumnus. Carl, where are you? Yes, oh, there he is back there. How many people do we have here? I think we have a good contingent of alumni. How many people here are alumni or associated in some way with Hillsdale College? Raise your hand. All right. Hillsdale does a great job. Dr. Folsom's published 6 books, including The Myth of the Robber Barons. Now it's in its 5th edition. We're doubly lucky to have with us his wife, Anita. Glad to have you, Anita. And they are now, I'm happy to say, part-time, half of the year residents of Georgia. So we're going to have to make more use of them and have to invite them to come to our events more often. Please welcome Dr. Burt Folsom.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Rogers and Mary Margaret and all those with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. It's a great group. And Anita, I want to thank Anita, my indispensable right arm, and someone who went along with me wholeheartedly, the originator of the idea, let's go to Atlanta. And you hear these identifications. Folsom went to Pittsburgh, Indiana, and Nebraska, and all this. We are happy in Georgia. We heard people say, this is a cold winter we're having. It's the warmest winter we've had in decades. Thank you. We are delighted to be here, and we love Atlanta. And the Georgia Public Policy Foundation does good work because it asks the right questions. Let me look at it this way. With the New Deal and the 1930s and the Great Depression, you hear talk with President Obama and parallels to FDR and the Great Depression. How many have done some thinking about the Great Depression that started in the 1920s? How many have been getting some thought to that? The question I needed to ask you really was, which depression of the 1920s are you giving thought to? Because there were actually 2. And that is an interesting story in itself. We had one that occurred in the early 20s and one that started in the late 20s. The one in the early 20s is not often studied. But after World War I, We had 4 and 5 million American soldiers. They come home. They can't get jobs. They're unemployed. We can't seem to integrate them back into the American economy. So that in 1920 we had a high unemployment rate, and the economy was a major issue in the 1920 campaign. 1921 we had if you round it off, it's 11.7, rounded off to 12% unemployment. Now put that in perspective, right? The most recent unemployment rate, quarterly unemployment, was 7.6%. So we have 7.6% today. We had 12% in 1921. And there was talk of major recession. Very rarely in American history do we have unemployment that gets up at that 12% level. The issue is, what are we going to do? Elected in 1920 were Warren Harding as president, Calvin Coolidge as vice president. I have to mention Coolidge, of course, because Harding dies in the middle of his first term. So Coolidge will finish out the term and then be elected in his own right to serve most of the term of the second term. So he was president during most of the 1920s. But those two were in agreement. The question was, what should we do? One of the suggestions that was very strongly advocated to deal with these soldiers coming home and the high unemployment rate was, let's develop a kind of stimulus package. Road building, you know, they said the Golden Gate Bridge, Hoover Dam, we have, and the auto, as you know, had come in and was a major part of American life by 1921. Highways. We could put these people to work in public works projects. And that way they'd be employed and we'd reduce the unemployment rate. Harding and Coolidge said, when they were confronted with that idea, and it was seriously suggested by many people, they said, I have a word for that. No. Coolidge was a man of few words. That was one of his better words, applied correctly to the right situation. And when people would say, well, why not? He said, because if we put those people to work on roads, sure, they become all of a sudden employed. Yes, it might stimulate the various sectors of the economy that run along the lines of that road, but where are we going to get the money to pay for it? We'll have to raise taxes, and that will stifle growth at that end. In fact, Harding said, and Coolidge agreed, we need to do two things. We have a two-pronged program to deal with this budding Great Depression of 12%. The program was this: cut taxes, tax rates in particular, cut the tax rate, and cut spending. Because if you cut spending, you get the interest rates down, you get a stable economy, people will want to invest in the United States because it will be solid, and with the declining interest rates and the tax rates also going down, it will stimulate entrepreneurship, the low interest rates will attract investment. That will then later provide the jobs for those soldiers and for others who are unemployed. And some people say, what jobs? I mean, how do we know this will work? The Constitution promises limited government. Article 1, Section 8 does not give the federal government authority to intervene vastly in federal public works program, and we're not going to do it. Thus, we had in the 1920s a major tax cut, bringing the income tax rate down to a maximum of 25%. And then we also had federal spending cut to the point that we had not just balanced budgets, but budget surpluses every year of the 1920s. Every year of the 1920s. The last decade in American history for which we can make that statement. Every year we had budget surpluses. I got to figuring this out. It was so much fun to study. We chopped a third of the national debt off in the 1930s. So every year we were chopping more so that our national debt was reduced. The country was increasingly prosperous because we had to pay less for debt service. I did some figuring. I said, how much is it that we reduced? And I got it down to how much a day were we chopping off the national debt. Then that was fun. And I thought, how much an hour? And then how much a second? $20 a second. And this is 1920s dollars. This is worth $300 in today's purchasing power. $20 a second. Every second of the 1920s, we reduced the national debt. You know, sometimes you've seen that national debt index that's constantly rolling forward, what our national debt is. Now we've had to really punch it into high gear. It's really rolling forward. Try to imagine it in the 20s if we'd had such advice, rolling backwards. We owe less today than we did yesterday by $20 a second, every second. So we cut the income tax rates. The first thing we found was that when we cut the income tax rates down to 25%, they were up, the top rate was up to 70%, over 70%. When we cut that rate down, revenue increased. As Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of Treasury, said, 73% of nothing is nothing. 25% of something is something. He was very soft-spoken, but those words made sense. We brought capital into the economy. The inventions of the 1920s were fantastic. Many of you know about radio was invented and developed, and most homes had radios by the end of the decade. An enormous advance in technology. We had other inventions that had been around a little bit, but began to really be sparked by the 20s, like vacuum cleaners and refrigerators. Yeah, we used to have an iceman come around and put a block of ice in the so-called ice box, and you put your food on that block of ice. Yeah. Well, we put that poor man out of business with the refrigerator. But we also created tremendous industry around that employed a lot more people. Then we had, invention. How many sliced bread was invented in the 1920s? We have inventions like Scotch tape. Others that came in. An example, we had the invention, and this is one that was not irrelevant to the city of Atlanta. We had the invention in the 1920s of air conditioning. At least the development and application of air conditioning on a big scale in the 1920s. And it was similar. Willis Carrier was the inventor and developer of air conditioning. He started out that he was employed by a print company, that they were saying, we'd like to employ you because we're printing books and we're printing magazines and other items, to invent something that will dehumidify the room. You dehumidify the room, and then with the humidity reduced, the pages will not smear and the ink will not smear as we print items off the press. And so he figured out a way to dehumidify a room, and one thing he found, that as you dehumidified, you cooled the room. And that stuck in his mind. I have a market for dehumidifying, but I might be able to convert this into something that would actually cool the air. It'll take a little bit of work. But he said, when the income tax rate is 73%, as it was during World War I to pay for the war, they had that rate. He says, I'm not going to invest if it's 73%. And so what he did was, instead, he did nothing. He did his little dehumidifying devices and helped the printing companies. Then the rates go down to 25%. Then he says, now I get to keep most of what I make. And when the rates went down, he tried a major expansion. And the first group to buy one of these air conditioners was a movie theater. You know, you think, well, who'd buy like a factory or maybe some big home or something? A movie theater. Summer sales in the movie business in the 20s sagged during the summer because it was hot and humid in the theaters. The Rivoli Theater in Manhattan in New York took a chance on Carrier's air conditioning. And they bought one in, and lo and behold, the attendance dramatically increased. And of course they're debating, saying, wow, we're going to pay off this air conditioner with the increased attendance. And someone said, Bob, but it may be the movie's better this time around. You know, we don't know that it's the air conditioning that's bringing them into the theater for sure. So they did an early example, 1920s style, of an exit poll. And they thought, we've got to do our exit poll right. We can't say, do you like the air conditioning? And they'll say, yes, but that doesn't tell us, did they like the movie better? See, so they had to be subtle. And so the exit poll started with the question, did you like the movie today? And the first person comes out and he says,
What movie? I don't care what's on that screen. I'm trying to get out from what's out there. 2 hours of cool air. And you get a few people coming on that, and they said, I don't think we need to continue our exit poll very much more to know that the air conditioning is working. By the end of the 1920s, 300 theaters had air conditioning. We had the invention in the 1920s of the zipper. The zipper. It was so primitive. The guy who invented it, Gideon Sundbeck, was a Swedish immigrant. And he took his zipper to the patent office. He didn't call it a zipper back then. He called it hookless number 2. It was patented as hookless number 2. And the guy at the patent office said, now I will patent this product. That's my job. But I honestly can't figure out what use anyone could ever have for this. And lo and behold, the first use we had in World War I was he sold some to the U.S. Army for money purses, so when the soldiers went out and got drunk on the weekend, they wouldn't have their money stolen as easily because it would be zipped up in this little purse around their belt. And then after the war, we had no sales, no market. And Sundbeck said, well, it's 73% tax rates. Why should we? Why should I take this chance and go out and market this when 3/4 of my money, if I'm successful, this is the top rate, will ultimately go to the government? And so he didn't do it, and then the rates come down. B.F. Goodrich purchased 200,000 hookless number 2s to put on women's galoshes. That was the breakthrough product. And they advertised in, it may have been Good Housekeeping, one of the women's magazines, and Madison Avenue got a hold of hookless number 2, and they had a picture of this woman, and she had, I don't know, is a singular galosh? I don't know. She had one of these things up, and they were zipping it, and it had the caption, "Zip her up." That's what Madison Avenue came up with, zip her up, and the name zipper caught on from that. And people were surprised they found other uses for the zipper after the women's galoshes. And what this showed people, from a public policy standpoint is, you open up markets by entrepreneurship. You cut the tax rates, and unexpected positive things develop, and entrepreneurs invent that you couldn't plan or anticipate. Aha, if we cut tax rates, someone will invent air conditioning, and they will be happy in Atlanta. You turn them loose, and then the products that they come up with end up being the reward that society gets for the creativity of humankind coming to bear and competing to try to produce products on the market that will appeal to customers. And we had a lot of them. As I mentioned, sliced bread, Scotch tape, but zipper, air conditioning. So that what we ended up with was a burgeoning economy by the late 1920s. 1% national unemployment in 1929, the lowest rate in the industrialized world. A budget surplus for 10 straight years. Now, to those of us interested in public policy, as we are here at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, there are lessons to be learned from that experiment. But history doesn't always provide lessons that people learn eagerly, because President Hoover came in, and Hoover came in after Coolidge, and he was really a member of another faction of the Republican Party. Hoover, as Secretary of Commerce in 1921, had urged Harding and Coolidge spend on road building. The stimulus package man was Herbert Hoover in 1921. And once we began to develop issues in the late 20s, he sprung into action with spending programs. The first problem, we can't really blame Hoover. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates dramatically, and Milton Friedman has won a Nobel Prize arguing this really triggered the beginning of the Great Depression, because it made it harder for borrowers to get money with the higher interest rates. So that clearly was something that came into play. Raising the protective tariff. How many have heard of the Smoot-Hawley tariff? I'm glad. The highest tariff in U.S. history. It was a tariff that made it almost impossible for foreigners to trade with us. For example, we had watches that we produced in the United States.
that were $3 a piece, and the Swiss watches were $1.50. Of course, that would be much more in today's money. The Swiss watches kept perfect time. The American watches ran the hour in 58 minutes. And some of you may remember those days where we had to set our watches in the morning, and that's what our watches did. And so we had watchmakers of Connecticut and Rhode Island, which is where they were concentrated, said, ooh, let's get a tariff on our watches so we don't have to compete with the Swiss watches. Because everybody wants Swiss watches, and hardly anybody, even our family members, don't want to buy our watches. And so lo and behold, we get this tariff of 200% almost on Swiss watches. So now it costs $4 to $5 to buy a Swiss watch. See, they had to make the tariff really high, because if they would have been equal, we'd have still bought the Swiss watches. But if the Swiss watch is almost twice as high, more would buy the American. And they said, look, we have an increase in the sale of watches. Ha ha! We protected American business. Well, this is nice if the story ends that way, but then the Swiss said, you know, do you think that they're going to react by saying, well, let's see, the watchmaking is our #1 industry, the United States is our #1 customer. We're now almost all unemployed. Let's just go aw shucks and get in the unemployment line and continue to buy American typewriters and cars. No. All of a sudden, retaliatory tariffs came, and Switzerland put huge tariffs on American autos, which were competitive. Other European countries did so as well, because I mentioned watches as an example, but we put tariffs on British wool blankets, on Spanish olives, all down the line, up and down for Europe. They put retaliatory tariffs on us. All of a sudden, the American auto industry, you know, having lived in Michigan, is 5 million sales of cars in 1929 is down to 1.5 million in 1932. So now Michigan is in a Great Depression. And of course, they're sitting there saying, what did we do wrong? You know, you get circumstances of public policy here that are important. High tariffs, high Federal Reserve rate. And then Hoover said, aha, we need to raise the income tax rate. So the income tax rate goes up, and the United States is in a Great Depression. Now, when Franklin Roosevelt came in, he promised to go back to the public policy of Harding and Coolidge. He said, I want to cut tax rates and have a balanced budget. In fact, they had a provision in the Democratic platform to cut the federal spending by 25%. And he said, everybody I bring in my cabinet has to be committed to that principle. Roosevelt got into office and proceeded to do almost the exact opposite. We had budget-busting budgets each year so that we had a national debt doubling in his first 2 terms. Whereas we cut a third off during Harding and Coolidge's, we doubled the national debt. The programs that Roosevelt put into effect, he began to buy into the argument massive federal spending is needed to resolve unemployment that had reached 25% in 1932. He would go from interest group to interest group trying to get a federal program to appeal to that interest group. For example, the farmers. The farmers had the policy given to them of the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now this policy, I think of it and I explain it, and my students today look at me like, this is weird. And I have to sometimes say, only academics could come up with this program. Academics from Columbia University and also Montana State teamed up and gave us the idea, let's get out of the Great Depression by paying farmers not to produce. And you can see the logic here. It's incredible. Farmers are having low prices for their crops. Well, yes, that's true, because about 1/4 of American farming is exported. Well, with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, they weren't buying our farm products because we weren't buying Switzerland's watches. See? So the answer, you know, you'd think, common sense answer would be, well, let's cut the tariff. Well, the problem is that there are interest groups that have a stake, like the watchmakers, and they have their Connecticut and Rhode Island senators who say, well, let's cut some tariffs, but not ours. You know, and so Roosevelt says, oh, well, let's not do that, so that the farm prices remain low. And he says, well, wait, if the farm prices are down here, one way to bring them up here is to have farmers produce about 1/4 less than they're producing, right? Because we used to export about 1/4. So 1/4 less, and then if we have that reduced supply, then the price will go up because there won't be as much farm produce on the market. And so if we pay farmers not to produce on about a fourth of their land, then they'll get money from the payment, and they'll get money from the increase not to for the lower production, and then they'll be happy. You know, those who were buying bread at 25% more all of a sudden, I don't think they were so happy. And this is part of the problem. The low income that people had was now being consumed on increased products for farm prices, while farmers were being paid not to produce. Then we had the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was the road building junkets that were done. And this is interesting because Roosevelt immediately said, aha, we need roads built, and we're now going to do what was proposed in the early 1920s by Hoover, and that is the massive road building campaigns. And Roosevelt said, well, yes, we're going to do this, and the way we're going to do it is, see, I know in theory, you hear, because you hear this today, well, let's build roads, we need infrastructure improvements. Well, you have unlimited demand for infrastructure. And so then the question is, who's going to get the roads and who isn't? And the one thing we found was kind of interesting was that the people who got the roads were those people who were Democrats who cooperated with Roosevelt. He had a man under him named Emil Hurya, and he and James Farley, Postmaster General, worked to find who gets the roads and who doesn't. And Hurya asked this question, quote, what swing states or congressional districts would benefit from special injections of federal dollars? That's literally a memo. What swing states or congressional districts would benefit from special injections of federal dollars? And he went on to say, federal appropriations segregated by department for your state. He's talking with all Democrats running for office. And he says, we have given you a list here of federal appropriations segregated by department for your state. You can use this any way you like in speeches, rallies, radio talks, or newspaper interviews. That way, the Democrats could cite these projects and say, if you will re-elect me, or if you will elect me, I can bring more of this because I'm in good with the president. And the president would have meetings with these people and say, go back home and tell them you really talked with me about your roads and that kind of thing. And so what we have is this remarkable thing. Listen, the governor of Maine is running for re-election. And here's his campaign. He says in the newspaper, quote, the knowledge and force of Governor Louis Brand, his name was Governor Brand, secured from the federal government $108 million for Maine, providing employment for 44,000 people. Then, in case the voters missed the point, Brand went on to say, the Roosevelt policies are such that a state must have friendly contacts with Washington to properly serve the interests of its people. So vote for me, and I will bring more of this federal spending into my district. James Guffey was running for election to be senator from Pennsylvania. And Guffey said this in his campaign. Let me get this for Guffey. He said, Pennsylvania is a swing state, very important, because Hoover carried it in 1932, and Roosevelt wanted to carry it in 36. So getting a Democratic senator in there was very important, too. Guffey made the point in his ads that Pennsylvania had paid into the federal government in taxes $297,942,173. That's what Pennsylvania paid. But it received in federal benefits $678 million. See, so it received over twice of what it spent. So the revenue coming into Pennsylvania, because Roosevelt wanted to carry it. So Roosevelt was saying, listen, we've got the federal treasury ready. We're going to get it in there. We want to carry it. And Guffey said this in his ad, quote, compare this $297,942,173 contributed by Pennsylvania to the U.S. Treasury with the $678,074,195 contributed by Pennsylvania by the Roosevelt Democratic administration. Yeah. So Guffey won his election. Guffey won his election. And poor Alf Landon, you have to feel sorry for the Republicans. They're running against Roosevelt in 1936 for president, Governor Landon of Kansas, and he's saying, wait a minute, this is just pork spending. And there's a lot of agreement. So he says, hey, I've got an issue here. Pork spending, this is just wasteful spending. And then he'd go to these areas and they say, are you going to take our bridge away from us? Oh, well, I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but we're going to get some of this reduced. And then he went to the farm country. After all, he was governor of Kansas, and he said, this AAA paid people not to produce. That's stupid. And they said, are we going to lose our subsidy? And he ended up saying, well, no, but we're going to do it more efficiently than they do. So the voters had a choice. Vote for the guy who gave them this subsidy and promises to continue it, or a guy who's going to do it better, but hasn't done anything for them yet. I guess the answer to that question was in the electoral vote in 1936. Roosevelt, 523 electoral votes. Governor Landon, 8. And therein is dramatic change in United States public policy, because we're in this crazy situation where the pork helps Roosevelt be reelected. It does not get us out of the Great Depression because we're having to raise tax rates. Roosevelt raises the tax rates to 79% on top incomes. He later proposes a 99.5% tax on all income over $100,000. So that if you earn $200,000 on your second $100,000 under the Roosevelt proposal, you would get to keep. Do we have any math majors here? How much?
500.
That's correct. Say it loud.
500.
500. You keep 500 and send 99,500 to Washington. When that failed to make it through Congress, Roosevelt said, I need revenue. We had the first gas tax. We had a tax on cars. We had a tax on tires. We had a tax on telegrams. Then people were calling to tell each other about how bad it was, so we had a tax on telephone calls. Then he found out people were going to the Marx Brothers movies to escape, so we had a tax on movie tickets. We get all of the excise taxes, and finally Roosevelt, through executive order, the 100% tax on all income over $25,000. Congress took it, and because Congress can deal with executive orders, repealed it and made it 90. Can you see why the Great Depression goes on and why Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury makes this comment? We have tried spending money and it does not work. We are spending more than we have ever spent before. This is 1939, after unemployment came in at 20.7% for April 1939. Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's friend, and his Secretary of Treasury says, we have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot. We had doubled the national debt, and we still had 20% unemployment. The lesson for public policy. Good public policy, as we had in the early 20s, wiped out a recession that was potentially so severe that we hardly even know about it in history. All we know about is the roaring 20s with the zippers and the air conditioning and the entrepreneurship and the refrigerators. And the Great Depression came through in the 1930s. We tried a different set of public policies, of massive federal spending, and as the Secretary of Treasury himself said, we have tried spending, and it does not work. Our challenge as citizens, Georgians, employees of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, to get the message out. What worked, what didn't work. As that message comes out, it allows people to make better decisions on the American economy. The lack of clear economic information has to a large extent been responsible for pursuing some of the policies we've been pursuing in our present crisis. The purpose of this book, a lesson from the past, what worked, what didn't work in the 1920s, in the 1930s. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think we all agree with you on the premise here, but the linchpin seems to be the whole thing. And the issue is the pork cycle.
The pork
you
cycle.
You can't break the pork cycle. You can't get where you're at. How do you do that? Because everybody wants that bridge to somewhere.
You know, this is a good question. How do you break the pork cycle? This is a major concern because once the pork cycle's in there, it's hard to dislodge people from their benefits. Hey, we have some examples where we did break the pork cycle. For example, in just recent years, in 1996, the pork cycle was there with AFDC spending, aid to families with dependent children. Started during the New Deal. Started federal aid to unwed mothers. And we had aid to those mothers, and of course in the 1960s we sharply increased the aid. And that aid made it so that women who had children had no incentives to get married, because if you got married, you would lose the aid. And the aid was so large that the incentives to have children out of wedlock increased. In 1960, 1 out of every 20 children in this country were born out of wedlock to a single parent. In 1995, 1 out of 3. And although some parents who grew up in single-parent families have done amazingly well, I mean, Bill Bennett is one of them. You have to overcome obstacles because the statistical evidence simply is that even though some families are not the greatest, that you tend to have more help in a 2-parent family than you do in one, that students tend to do better growing up there. And so we had that side. We broke it in 1996. The contract with America came in, and as you may remember, in 1994, Newt Gingrich and others said, we are going to pass welfare reform. We passed the Temporary Aid to Needy Families, TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, cut about half the people off the welfare roll, and had balanced budgets by the late 1990s. A tremendous, huge budget item was all of a sudden cut in half. Now, we didn't cut the whole cycle, but we actually saw a significant cut. Bill Clinton ultimately signed that bill. Of course, he vetoed 2 of them before he finally signed one. But he did sign one. Dick Morris told him, you don't sign this bill, you're not going to win in 1996. And reluctantly, he signed it. We had a huge reduction in that program. Now, I'm just saying, we have some precedent. It has been done, but you have identified a big problem, which is why we don't want to get another set of entitlement people receiving pork right now, because it is hard to get that changed. Question back there. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the interstate highway system?
Yes.
It's a huge federal program, and have we been misled? Did that have all kinds of problems too, and is it not the success that we thought it was?
The question is on the interstate highway program. Was it successful or whatever? Technologically, it was fairly successful because we did get a system of highways. The alternate way of doing this was the way Henry Ford did it, when initially we had privately constructed highways, where you got together with the tire makers, the battery makers, and others, and begin to build highways. And of course, states were starting to do it with toll roads. So we were starting to have some of this before the federal government was involved. By the 50s, the federal government was involved very big. Dwight Eisenhower was facing fairly high unemployment, 5 to 6%, not quite what it is today. And he said, I know what let's do. Let's have public works and stimulus spending through an interstate highway system. See, the example again, not learning from history, clearly. We began to get the interstate highway system in, and lo and behold, all the jobs we created, and there were many, were offset by the increase in taxes and the budget deficit and the inflation that had to come from printing more money. That created a cycle of demoralization on the economy. The unemployment went up to higher than it is today, almost 8%, and Dwight Eisenhower, in the election after the interstate system went into effect, lost for the Republican Party 47 seats in the House of Representatives. Because every job that was created, building federal job on the highway system, was offset either by a tax hike or by printing money, an inflationary spiral, the demoralization set in, and the Republican Party lost seats. So that is, Eisenhower looked at it as public works. He said, hey, we tried this in the 30s, let's try it again. It didn't work in the 30s. It didn't work in the 50s. Yes, sir.
Why would people who went through the 20s vote for Roosevelt by a landslide in the 30s, and the second part of that is why do historians continue to rank him like the third best president after Lincoln and Washington?
Yeah, why do historians continue to rank Roosevelt so high is the second part of the question. That's what stimulated the book. When I saw my fellow historians ranking Franklin D. Roosevelt as a better president than George Washington, and the top in the country, he and Lincoln at the top, better than everybody else, I said, there are certain professional obligations that one has. And one of mine is to set the record straight if my colleagues won't. And so I felt I had to write the book. Now, the other question is kind of interesting. How can these people in the 20s swing around and vote? And that shows, in a way, that we didn't really learn the lessons of the 1920s. It's interesting. A lot of times, Coolidge was not a braggart. You know, he was very quiet. If I had an administration like Coolidge that had the lowest 3.3, in his 6 years he had 3.3% unemployment average and 1% inflation. Some of you know the misery index we talk about. Georgia's President Carter gave us that term, remember? The misery index, we add unemployment and inflation, and then that's one of the measures of prosperity. Coolidge, if you look at his 3.3% and unemployment and 1% inflation, that's 4.3%. That is the lowest misery index of any president of the 20th century. And the next two that are closest to him are over 8. And he at 4.3. No wonder he won a huge re-election in 1924. Now, if it had been me, I'd have said, look at me, look at my policies. They work. I cut spending. I've got balanced budgets every year. Coolidge just kind of said, let's let the facts speak for themselves. I'm not this kind of guy that's going to go around telling everybody how wonderful I am. And he was quiet about it. And since Hoover was a Republican who succeeded him, although from a different wing of the party. In fact, Hoover, remember, was in Coolidge's cabinet. And Coolidge had a nickname for Hoover. He called him Wonder Boy. Because of all his bright ideas for spending. He said, Hoover's been giving me, he said this privately, Hoover's been giving me advice for all 6 years of my presidency. All of it bad.
We got time for one more.
Go ahead. Yes, sir.
When and how did the Great Depression end?
I'm sorry, what was it?
When and how did the Great Depression end?
Good question. This is still an issue that's unknown, that is open for research. Most people say World War II. How many have heard, well, World War II, the great spending for the war got us out of the Depression. In a technical sense, it did, in that unemployment went way down, but the national debt went up because we were paying for the soldiers and for the military equipment. And so the national debt went from $40 billion to $260 billion. So you can't say that. See, the issue is what happens after the war. Are these people going to be employed or not? Most historians, some, are beginning to say, hey, Roosevelt's death created an expansion in optimism. Businessmen said, I may not get taxed 100%. Whoopee! Let's expand! And so Truman's administration was somewhat more sympathetic to business expansion, and that seems to have been a big help. This is still an area, though, that I think is open for research. That's a current line of thinking. Kelly.
Dr. Folsom, thank you very much. Remember, we have books for sale in the back, and Dr. Folsom will be hanging around to answer your questions and sign the books. And we appreciate you coming today. We look forward to seeing you on April 16th. Till then.